The message came through on a Tuesday. I know that because I was eating a cold sandwich at my desk inside the Galactic Conclave's Human Liaison office when every screen in the building turned red. Not the soft amber alert that meant a procedural dispute. Not the pale blue that signaled a trade conflict. Red. The deep, solid red they reserved for things that could not be undone. I set down my sandwich and read the words on the screen 3 times before they became real to me. New Carthage. Contact lost. I had been working inside this building for 15 years. I had sat through more than 600 diplomatic sessions. I had watched empires negotiate, posture, collapse, and rebuild themselves under new names. I had shaken hands with species who had 6 fingers, no fingers, and appendages that had no word in any human language. I had learned to smile at beings who found smiling deeply unsettling, and to stand completely still in front of species who interpreted movement as aggression. I was good at my job. I had spent 15 years being extremely good at a job whose entire purpose was to make humanity look small and harmless and unthreatening. New Carthage was not small. It was home to 3.2 million people. Farmers who had spent decades pulling crops from mineral-rich volcanic soil. Engineers who had built water systems in places where water had never existed before. Teachers, doctors, children, a colony that had worked for 30 years to make something livable out of nothing, and had succeeded in a way that people back on Earth talked about with quiet pride. I had visited once, 8 years earlier, for the opening of their first ocean desalination plant. A girl named Clara had pressed a paper flower into my hand at the ceremony. She was 6 years old. She was wearing red shoes. I remember thinking that the shoes were very bright against the pale stone of the plaza. The second message came 4 minutes after the first. The Drath hegemony had issued a territorial correction notice. That was the phrase they used. Territorial correction. As though 3.2 million people had been a mathematical error that had been quietly resolved. I pushed my chair back from the desk. I walked to the door of my office and stood there for a moment looking at the corridor, where other liaison staff were moving quickly between rooms, voices low, faces tight. Then I walked to the conclave chamber. My legs worked fine. My hands were steady. I had learned a long time ago that real grief, the kind that goes all the way down, does not shake you. It settles into you like weight added to the bottom of a ship. It keeps you level. It makes you very, very still. The chamber was already full by the time I arrived. 240 species represented around the curved floor table, their translation devices humming softly, their aides and attachés sitting behind them in tiered rows. The session had been called on emergency order. I took my seat in the human delegation box and looked across the chamber floor at the Drath representatives. There were 4 of them. They were tall, broad-shouldered, with pale gray scales and eyes the color of old ice. They were absolutely calm. One of them was reviewing something on a handheld screen. Another was speaking quietly to an aide. A third was pouring water into a glass with a steady hand. They looked like 4 people who had just finished a routine meeting and were waiting for the next one. High Consul Brennan sat beside me. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, and had dedicated his entire career to the belief that any problem could be solved through sufficient patience and careful language. He had served in galactic diplomacy for longer than I had been alive, and he was better at the formal performance of it than anyone I had ever met. He leaned toward me without turning his head. They have prepared a formal territorial explanation. The zone borders a section of space with contested mapping history, going back about 4 centuries. Their legal team has 300 pages of documentation. 300 pages, I said. It will take at least 3 sessions to present in full. I looked at the Drath delegation. I looked at the chamber full of species who were all ready. I could read it in the way they were sitting and the way they were not quite looking at the Drath, preparing to accept whatever explanation was coming, not because they approved of what had happened, because it was easier, because New Carthage was far away and the Drath fleet was real and close, and no species in that room wanted to spend political standing on a dead human colony that they had not been particularly invested in when it was alive. And after the 3 sessions? I asked Brennan. He was quiet for a moment. There will likely be a review committee, he said. The session lasted 9 hours. The Drath presented their territorial documentation. It was thorough, well-organized, and constructed with the kind of care that people put into arguments they know will be challenged, which meant they had known this was coming and had prepared accordingly. Species after species took the floor. The Varath Collective expressed deep concern and called for measured dialogue. The Solon Republic proposed an independent mapping review. The Orendal League offered to host a framework conversation at their central station. The Marin Sovereignty said nothing at all, which everyone in the room understood to mean that they had already decided to side with whoever came out of this with the larger fleet intact. Nobody said the word wrong. Nobody said that 3.2 million civilians had been killed, and someone needed to answer for that, in language that meant something. Nobody proposed a sanction with actual force behind it, or a consequence that would cost the Drath anything they could not easily absorb. I spoke once. I walked to the floor podium, and I said what I had prepared to say, which was simple and did not take long. I said that New Carthage had been a civilian colony, with no military installations and no weapons capacity. I said it had posed no territorial threat to any party, disputed mapping history or otherwise. I said the Drath hegemony had killed 3.2 million people and submitted the paperwork. The chamber was quiet for a few seconds. Then the representative from the Orendal League asked whether I had a specific legal counterargument to the territorial basis of the notice. I walked back to my seat. Brennan did not say anything. He put his hand on the table between us and looked straight ahead at the proceedings. I sat in my chair, and I looked at the floor of the Galactic Conclave chamber, and I allowed myself, very quietly and very privately, to understand something I had been working hard not to understand for a long time. The galaxy was not going to help us. The galaxy had looked at what happened to New Carthage, had sat in this room and listened to the explanation, and had decided that the most comfortable path forward was to process it and move on. Not because they were cruel, because they had done the calculation, and we had come up short. We were new. We were small. We had never, in 60 years of galactic membership, demonstrated that we were the kind of species whose displeasure needed to be taken seriously. We had been quiet and careful and unthreatening. We had followed every rule, attended every session, filed every document on time, and made ourselves as easy to overlook as possible. And the galaxy had overlooked us, right up until the moment it needed to look somewhere and find someone to help a colony of 3.2 million people, and it had looked at us and kept looking past. The session closed at midnight. I walked out of the chamber and stood in the outer corridor for a while. The lights there were lower, meant to accommodate species with light-sensitive eyes. Around me, other delegates moved toward their transport bays, talking quietly. I watched them and felt something settle in me that was not anger exactly, and was not grief exactly, but was something that combined elements of both into a single clear sensation. I found a private communications alcove and placed a call to Earth. Not the Foreign Office, not the Diplomatic Bureau, the War Council. I had the direct line because every human diplomat in the Conclave building had it, the way you keep a medical kit somewhere in every room, without planning to use it. I reported what I had seen. I was specific and factual. I said the Drath had presented territorial documentation. I said the Conclave had moved to review committee. I said no punitive measure had been proposed by any party. I said the Drath delegation had left the session composed and apparently satisfied. There was a pause. Then the voice of Secretary General Owen Darcy came through the line. He was 67 years old, had run Earth's global governance body for 2 terms, and had a voice that stayed level at all times regardless of what was happening on the other end of the conversation. "Thank you, Kale," he said. "Come home." I almost asked what that meant specifically. Then I heard, in the background of the call, the ambient sound of a large room where people had been awake for many hours and were no longer in the phase of a meeting where anything is still being debated. I booked my transport that night. 3 days later, I was standing in the arrivals terminal at Geneva Central with my bag at my feet, when every screen in the building went quiet for a moment. Then Owen Darcy's voice came through the public broadcast system, and through every galactic communication channel, and every diplomatic frequency simultaneously. 7 words. Humanity is mobilizing. We will not forget. People around me in the terminal stopped moving. Some of them looked up at the screens. Some of them just stood still with whatever they were holding. I stood with my bag, and I listened to those 7 words go out across the stars, and I felt something shift inside my chest, like the slow movement of something very heavy that has been held in place for a long time and has finally been allowed to move. I had spent 15 years telling the galaxy we were peaceful. I had believed it. I had said it so many times and in so many chambers and to so many faces that it had become, for me, a kind of truth. But standing in that terminal with those words still in the air, I understood that I had been wrong about the nature of what I had been describing. We had not been peaceful. We had been patient. And patience, I was beginning to understand, is not the same thing at all. I did not sleep on the transport back to Earth. I sat with the window beside me, showing nothing but the dark between stars, and I made myself think about Clara and her paper flower and her red shoes. I made myself think about it completely, and without looking away, because I had learned early in my career that looking away from things does not stop them from being true. It only means you encounter them later, when you are less prepared. When I landed in Geneva, a car was waiting. It took me directly to Fleet Command, which occupied a campus in the Alps that most citizens had never had cause to visit, and that had never appeared on any publicly released map of significant government facilities. I had expected urgency when I arrived. I had expected the particular energy of a large institution that had been caught unprepared and was now running to catch up. What I found instead was something I did not have a word for immediately. It took me a moment to identify it. Readiness. Not the readiness of people scrambling, the readiness of people doing something they have been prepared to do for a long time. Officers moved between stations at a regular pace. Voices were low and precise. Data moved across screens in organized streams. Nobody was raised. Nobody was running. The entire place had the calm of a machine that has been waiting to be switched on and is now simply running. Admiral Yara Osei was at the central tactical table when I was brought in. She was 51, built lean and straight from years of low-gravity service, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that revealed exactly as much as she chose to reveal, which was usually nothing at all unless she decided otherwise. She had commanded the Western Armed Defense Fleet for 9 years. She looked up when I walked in and acknowledged me with a slight nod. "Ambassador Morrow," she said. "I have been told I am not an ambassador anymore," I said. "That is correct. Sit down." What she showed me over the next 2 hours changed my understanding of the previous 30 years of my life. I had known, in the general way that senior diplomats know things they are not supposed to discuss, that Earth maintained a defense fleet. Every conclave member did. The membership agreements required a minimum military capacity, and humanity had always reported numbers that sat just above the required floor. Modest numbers. Careful numbers. The kind of numbers that encouraged other species to think of us as a medium-sized colonial power, with reasonable security needs and no particular ambitions. The actual number of active human warships was 12,400. They had been built over 30 years in the outer asteroid belts of our solar system, behind the daily traffic of commercial shipping lanes and mining operations and freight corridors that were all completely legitimate businesses and also extremely convenient physical cover. Every hull registered under civilian classification until the relevant moment. Every shipyard documented as a manufacturing facility for one of 47 different types of non-military equipment. The record-keeping had been meticulous. The concealment had been methodical. And the galaxy, which had looked at our reported fleet numbers and decided we were manageable, had never looked beyond the numbers because it had never felt the need to. "How did you build 12,000 warships without anyone noticing?" I asked. "Carefully," Admiral Osei said, "and by understanding that people tend to believe what they expect to see." She pulled up the specifications for a ship class I had never heard designated in any official document. the Endurance class. She walked me through it in detail. It was not a beautiful ship. It had none of the architectural flourish that the Drath or the Orendal put into their military vessels. No sweeping lines or ceremonial elements or weapons arrays designed to communicate power through their appearance. The Endurance class was built to be functional for a very long time, in very difficult conditions. Reinforced damage compartments, redundant drive systems, a weapons platform designed for coordinated action with other ships, rather than individual combat superiority. The thinking behind every design choice was not how do we look strong, but how do we keep fighting, after the other side believes we should have stopped. We never intended to frighten anyone, O.C. said. That was always understood. You do not build a deterrent by announcing it. You build it quietly, over time, and the deterrent is effective only if no one knows it exists until the moment it becomes relevant. And now it is relevant, I said. She looked at me directly. She had the eyes of someone who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where hesitation was more dangerous than the wrong choice. Yes, she said. Now it is relevant. The Drath sent their formal response to our mobilization announcement 6 days after Owen Darcy's broadcast. It came through the standard diplomatic channel, which meant it arrived in my old office at the Conclave, and a junior attaché named Peter Hollis forwarded it to me with a note that said simply, "Advise," which I appreciated for its directness. The message was what you would expect from people who had just discovered they had made a serious error in a confident direction. Formal outrage, precise legal language, a numbered list of treaty obligations, a reminder that the Drath hegemony was a founding member of the Conclave framework, and that unilateral military action by any member against hegemony interests would constitute violations of 6 separate framework agreements. It was thorough and professionally written. At the bottom of the formal language, in the plain phrasing that diplomats use when they want to be clearly understood regardless of translation, was a statement that the hegemony was fully prepared to defend its territorial integrity. Admiral Osei read it once, without expression. They believe we are positioning for a negotiation, she said. They have no reference point for the alternative, I said. She considered that. Transmit our response. The response had been prepared by the War Council before the Drath sent their message, before I had even landed in Geneva. This was the detail that made it real to me in a way nothing else had yet. The response was ready because the people who built 12,000 ships in the asteroid belt also drafted their communications in advance, because they had understood for a long time that this conversation was eventually going to happen. The response was 2 sentences. The first sentence was the legal name of New Carthage Colony, its official conclave registration number, and the number 3,200,000. The second sentence said, "We are coming." Then Earth went silent. I was assigned to the flagship Resolute as military diplomatic liaison. The ship was 600 meters long, gray-hulled, built with the same functional restraint as everything else I had seen in Fleet Command. No ceremonial coloring. No decorative structures. It was a ship that had been built to do one specific thing for as long as required, and it looked exactly like that. We crossed into Drath border space on day 8. On day 9, a Drath heavy patrol unit of 40 ships came into sensor range. Standard formation, standard armament. The kind of patrol group that had, in the last 20 years, been enough to end several serious political disputes simply by showing up. We sent 12 ships forward. I was standing at the observation rail on the bridge when the tactical display lit up with both formations. 12 against 40. The Drath began to spread their formation into an intercept pattern, cutting angles that would have closed off retreat corridors. They had done this before, many times, against opponents who understood that 40 warships meant it was time to choose between backing down and taking severe damage. Our 12 ships accelerated, not toward a gap in the Drath formation, directly into the center of it. The next 11 minutes were the quietest and the most precise thing I had ever watched. Our ships moved through the Drath formation, the way something sharp moves through resistance, not with a single impact but with a series of targeted, specific pressures, each one finding exactly the right point. I watched Drath ships go dark one by one on the sensor display. Not with explosions, not with the catastrophic system failures that meant a ship was gone. Quietly, drive systems cutting out, weapons going offline, communication arrays shutting down. Each ship becoming a sealed hull drifting in space with a living crew and no operational capacity. Our ships were targeting the neural centers of each vessel. They were not trying to destroy the patrol. They were trying to leave 40 ships floating with their crews alive, and their ability to do anything removed entirely. It took 11 minutes to process 40 warships with 12. The last transmission from the Drath patrol came through the comm station, in the final seconds before their array went down. The voice was the patrol commander, and it was the voice of someone encountering something that fell outside their categories of understanding. "What are these weapons?" he said. It came through less as a question and more as a statement of shock. "What are these ships? What is this?" Admiral Osei was at the central display. She did not look up. "Consequences," she said, very quietly. I stood at the window and looked at 40 dark ships drifting in a loose constellation against the stars. And I thought about 30 years of construction in the outer belt. And I thought about Owen Darcy's 7 words. And I understood that the galaxy was now paying a very different kind of attention than it had been paying 20 days ago. We had not wanted this. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. Nobody in Fleet Command or in the War Council or in any room I ever sat in had been eager for this. What we had done was study history, and history was unambiguous on the subject of what happens to peaceful people who remain peaceful when the situation calls for something else. We had built 12,000 ships because we had read enough history to know what it meant to not have them when you needed them. 12,000 ships, 11 minutes, 48 dark hulls, and across the galaxy, in the chamber where we had been told to file our complaints in committee, 240 species were looking at their sensor feeds and making calculations they had never made about us before. The Galactic Conclave called an emergency session on the 4th day. I know this because I received 17 separate diplomatic communications requesting my attendance, my formal statement, my personal intervention, and in one extraordinary case, my guarantee that humanity would act with what the sender described as proportional restraint. I read that one twice. Then I placed all 17 messages in a folder and did not open it again for 3 weeks. By day 7, the picture was clear enough that even the conclave members who had voted for review committee over New Carthage could no longer maintain the fiction that the situation was being managed. 6 Drath border systems had been engaged. The result in each case was identical. Human fleets arrived in numbers that removed any possibility of meaningful resistance, disabled the defensive infrastructure with a precision that other species' military analysts were still struggling to explain to their superiors, and transmitted a single demand for unconditional withdrawal. Then they waited. Exactly 48 hours. Then they advanced. No civilian infrastructure was targeted. No orbital platforms unrelated to military function were touched. The Drath military assets went dark. Everything else continued to operate. The conclave, which had spent 9 hours on legal arguments about why New Carthage did not warrant a formal resolution, now found itself trying to construct a response to a military campaign that was simultaneously undeniable, surgically precise, and almost impossible to condemn on humanitarian grounds without condemning the event that had caused it. I was on the Resolute when the first back-channel message arrived from the Varath Collective. It came not through the standard diplomatic relay, but through a private courier frequency that bypassed the Conclave's monitoring systems. The Varath had clearly been saving that frequency for exactly this kind of situation. I knew something about the Varath, 6-limbed, slight, with iridescent skin that shifted color with their emotional state. They were a quiet people who spoke carefully, and had the particular quality of those who had learned to be careful for reasons that were not freely chosen. They had lived under Drath economic dominance for over 200 years. They had watched what happened to New Carthage and had said nothing in the chamber, and I had understood at the time that their silence was not indifference. It was the survival behavior of a people who had learned what happened when they spoke loudly, within hearing of those who had power over them. The message was from Asha Koval, their senior diplomatic representative. I had met her at conclave receptions. She always seemed carefully composed, the way people seem when they have practiced keeping their faces neutral for so long that the practice has replaced the original expression entirely. The message was 4 sentences. She listed 4 supply depot coordinates in the border systems our fleets were operating near. She said the depots contained fuel, repair materials, and medical supplies. She included the access codes and noted that no formal agreement was needed on our side. The final sentence was, "We have been waiting for someone to do this for a long time." I read it 3 times. Then I found Admiral Osei and showed it to her without comment. She read it once. She said, "Accept." The Solon Republic followed 2 days later. Not through a private channel, on an open frequency, addressed to any human vessel operating in the Korath corridor. They transmitted docking authorization and a supply offer. When the Drath hegemony filed a formal protest with the conclave, the Solon Republic's diplomatic office sent back a response that was, by any technical standard, a politely worded statement that they had reviewed the protest and were not changing their position. The effect in the conclave chamber was as though someone had opened a window. Several species who had been carefully maintaining neutral positions began making quiet contact with our diplomatic staff. The conclave was not splitting into sides exactly. It was doing something more honest, something that happens in rooms full of powerful people when the balance of power shifts in a way that cannot be reversed. It was revealing what people had actually believed all along, but had not previously felt safe to say. I managed the diplomatic channels while Admiral Osei managed the tactical ones. We had a morning briefing every day at 6. She would tell me what was happening in the field. I would tell her what the conclave was doing and what the political environment looked like. She would consider it briefly and tell me what we were going to do, which was almost always what had already been planned, because the plan had been built by people who had spent decades thinking about how these situations develop. On day 12, the Drath proposed negotiations. I read the terms twice to make sure I was understanding them correctly. I was. They need a pause in the advance, I told Osei. That provision requiring us to freeze our positions during the negotiation period is the whole purpose of the proposal. Yes, she said. So we do not accept the terms. We do not accept the terms, she confirmed. We acknowledge receipt. We tell them we are reviewing the proposal. We continue the advance. And we transmit the full exchange to the conclave on an open channel, I said, because I was beginning to understand how she thought. She looked at me with what, on her face, was the equivalent of a slight smile. On an open channel, she said. It took 43 hours. The Drath, operating on the assumption that our acknowledgement of the proposal meant some form of consideration was underway, used the time to pull their remaining warships from 14 peripheral systems into a concentrated mass around their core worlds. It was sound strategy if you expected your opponent to pause. We did not pause. Our sensor arrays caught the fleet movement at hour 31. The full record, with timestamps, coordinates, and verified telemetry, was transmitted simultaneously to every conclave member address on record. The session that followed was different from every session I had sat through in 15 years. The silence between statements had a different texture to it, the kind of silence that forms when a large group of people arrives, simultaneously, at the same understanding. Asha Koval stood at the conclave podium for the first time in 11 years. She stood very straight. She named 3 things the Drath had done to the Varath people that had come before the conclave and been reviewed and filed and never resolved. Her voice was absolutely controlled. She did not look at the Drath delegation once during her statement. I was watching this on a screen in the ship's communications room. Several crew members had stopped their work and were watching too. None of that was what stayed with me longest. What stayed with me was the afternoon before the session, when we had docked briefly at a Varath resupply station in the Korath corridor. The station commander, a compact woman named Vera Solis, who managed the facility with a staff of 40, had given me a tour. At the end of it, she had taken me to a room off the main residential corridor where 20 children from the station's family quarters were doing schoolwork on handheld devices. She told me quietly that 6 of those children had been born on a Varath agricultural planet called Mevin. The Drath had placed Mevin under an economic blockade for 3 years over a mineral rights dispute. The blockade had caused a food shortage. 80,000 people had died. The conclave had reviewed it and determined it was a legal economic measure within existing trade frameworks. I stood in that room and looked at 20 children with their tablets, and I thought about Sarah. Sarah was 9 years old. She had survived New Carthage because she had been off-world on a school program when it happened, staying at a transit station with a group coordinator named Helen Marsh. When the news came, Helen said, Sarah had not made a sound. She had sat down on a bench in the corridor and been still for a very long time. Then she had asked whether her parents were on the survivor list. They were not on the survivor list. I had been given Sarah's file in the survivor welfare briefing packet, distributed to all senior staff in week 1. I had read it once and closed it, because I needed to stay functional, and reading it again would have made that harder. But I thought about it often, the way you think about something you have not found a way to put down. I sent a message to Helen Marsh from the supply station, asking how Sarah was doing. Helen wrote back 12 hours later. She said Sarah was quiet. She said Sarah asked a great many questions about what was happening and why. She said Sarah's most frequent question was, why did they let it happen? I did not have a clean answer. I wrote back, we are working to make sure it does not happen again. Helen responded, she will want to know if that is a real promise. I sat with that for a long time before I went back to the tactical room and looked at the 12 human fleets converging on the Drath core systems and thought, it is as close to a promise as anything I know how to make. The Drath issued a direct military communication on day 19, not through diplomatic channels. On the military frequency, addressed to Admiral Osei by name, from a Drath officer identified as Supreme Commander Vel Orath of the Hegemony Defense Fleet. He said humanity had made its position clear. He said further advancement toward Drath core space would be met with the full capacity of the defense fleet, which he placed at 800 warships. He said he was offering an opportunity to stop before an engagement occurred that neither side could recover from. He said it the way a person says something when they believe it is probably true, but have started to have doubts. Osei listened to the full recording. She sat with her hands flat on the table after it ended. 800, she said. Consistent with our estimates of their remaining concentrated capacity, the tactical officer confirmed. She nodded once. Send Commander Orath acknowledgement of receipt, nothing else. We crossed into Drath core space on day 22. The core fleet was exactly where the sensors said it would be. 800 warships arranged in a layered defensive formation around the 4 inhabited planets at the center of the hegemony. It was an impressive structure. Disciplined spacing, overlapping fields of coverage, command vessels positioned with real tactical intelligence. Someone had planned this carefully and had done a good job with what they had. We brought 4,000 ships. They emerged from coordinated jump entry points around the entire system. The sequence took 11 seconds. I watched the tactical display as the Drath sensor data propagated through their formation, and the geometry of their situation became unavoidable. No corridor was open. No direction offered a gap. Every axis of approach and every route of retreat was covered. We did not fire. Not a single weapon was activated. Admiral Osei opened a direct channel to Supreme Commander Orath and transmitted her demands clearly and without emphasis. The way you read a prepared list to someone who has had sufficient time to prepare themselves for its contents. Full military withdrawal from all occupied and contested systems. Dissolution of the hegemony's military command structure for a period of not less than 20 years, with oversight transferred to a neutral body designated by the conclave. Full cooperation with a war crimes proceeding administered by independent parties. Comprehensive reparations to be assessed by an independent economic panel. Public acknowledgement of responsibility for New Carthage. And the number 3,200,000 to be entered into the hegemony's permanent historical record as the cost of what they had chosen to call a territorial correction. 24 hours to respond. I stayed on the bridge for most of those 24 hours. The 2 formations held their positions, ours static and complete, filling the sensor displays with the kind of numbers that have a particular effect on the people reading them. Theirs held in place, not going anywhere, not yet accepting that they were not going anywhere. The hours passed very quietly. At hour 22, the Drath moved. Not the full fleet. A group of approximately 200 warships broke from the formation in a concentrated push, driving toward a sector of our encirclement where the coverage was thinnest. It was a sound instinct. Under ordinary conditions, against an opponent who had extended their formation thin to achieve the encirclement, a concentrated punch through the weakest point was the right move. There was no weak point. 3 human fleets converged on that sector with a response time that the Drath formation commander described, in his last transmission before his systems went offline, as impossible. The remaining 600 ships held their ground, not because holding was a good option, because accepting the situation was not something their training had prepared them to do. At hour 23, our long-range sensors flagged something that made the temperature in the room change. It was not a warship. The intelligence team identified it in 4 minutes. A mass denial installation on the surface of one of the core planets. A device designed to render a planetary atmosphere unable to sustain life through a cascade disruption effect. It had been built 20 years ago and reported to no one. Our intelligence had not found it, because no one had been searching for it, because no one had expected to be standing in exactly this position, with the Drath in exactly this condition. People who have spent 6 centuries as the dominant force in a region and suddenly find themselves with no options sometimes make decisions they would not make with more room to think. The device had a preparation window of 11 minutes from initiation to irreversible effect. Our sensors flagged it at 9 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. Admiral Osei looked at me across the tactical table. She was not asking me to make the decision. She had already made it. She was looking at me because she needed me to understand what she was doing and why, completely and clearly, so that when I had to account for it later to the people who would ask, I could do so truthfully. 3 destroyers, she said. Crews of 40. I understand, I said. She opened a channel to the 3 closest destroyer captains. She told them the nature of the target. She told them the window. She told them what reaching it in time would require. She said they had 60 seconds to respond, and that any response was acceptable. All 3 responded in less than 30 seconds. I will not record their names here in this account, not because they do not matter, but because they matter more than a line in someone else's story, and they deserve a proper accounting in their own right. But I know their names. I have known their names every day since. I will know them for the rest of my life. The installation went offline at 43 seconds before its activation window. The 3 ships that reached it in time did not return from the approach. This was not a failure of the ships or of the crews. It was the arithmetic of the situation, and the arithmetic was what it was. The Drath Core fleet stood down at hour 23 and 51 minutes. Supreme Commander Orath transmitted his intent to surrender at hour 23 and 54 minutes. He requested negotiated terms. He used the phrase, mutual understanding going forward. He asked for a designated diplomatic representative for dialogue. Admiral Osei transmitted back that the terms had been provided and that there was nothing to negotiate. Orath came aboard the Resolute the following morning. He walked into the conference room with the posture of someone who had spent 60 years being the most powerful figure in any space he occupied. He sat across from Admiral Osei and looked at her for a long moment with an expression I could not categorize precisely. Somewhere between assessment and something he had not fully processed yet. You could have destroyed us entirely, he said. Yes, she said. Why did you not? She was quiet for a moment, not searching for the answer, considering how complete an answer to give. Because we are not doing this for you, she said. We are doing this for every species you have not reached yet. He sat with that. He looked at the table. He looked at her hands. She slid the surrender document across the surface toward him. He read it slowly. He read the clause about New Carthage. He read the clause about the reparations. He read the clause about the war crimes proceeding. He picked up the instrument beside the document and signed his name. The war had lasted 26 days. Outside the viewport, 4,000 human ships held their positions around the Drath home system in absolute silence. In 600 years, nothing had moved through those stars without Drath permission. Nothing had been built there without Drath approval. No species had sat in a room on a Drath world and handed them something they were required to sign. I stood near the door of the conference room and watched Orath set down the instrument and push the document back across the table, and I thought about a girl named Clara, with red shoes and a paper flower, and I thought about Sarah on her bench in a corridor, asking about the survivor list, and I thought about 120 names that I was going to carry with me for the rest of my life. The war had lasted 26 days. The waiting had lasted 30 years. And now we went home. 1 year later, I stood at the podium at the center of the Galactic Conclave chamber. The same room, the same curved floor table, the same banners of 240 species hanging from the upper tier, the same translation arrays humming at their frequencies, everything physically identical. The room was entirely different. I had been in that chamber hundreds of times in 15 years. I knew the ambient sound of it, the particular collective noise of 240 delegations present at once, the murmur of side conversations, the shuffle of attendants. That day there was none of it. The room was quiet in the way that a room full of people is quiet when everyone in it has decided that paying attention is more important than any other thing they could be doing. I did not begin with a prepared address. I had written one, and I set it aside at the podium. I said a number. I said it once, clearly, without context or introduction. 3,200,000. Then I read the names of the 3 destroyer crews. 120 names. I said each one in full, first name and last, without abbreviation. I did not rush. I was at that podium for 34 minutes before I said anything other than names. No one in the chamber made a sound. When I finished the names, I said the name Sarah. I told the chamber that Sarah was 10 years old. I told them she lived in a place called Somerset, in the west of England, with a foster family named the Garretts who had taken her in when there was nowhere else for her to go. I said she had recently started learning the piano, and that her instructor described her as unusually determined. I said she still asked questions about why things happened the way they did, and that her questions were always precise and deserved better answers than they usually got. Then I told the chamber that Sarah's most recent question to me, 3 weeks ago during a visit, had been whether the galaxy was a safer place now than it had been when she was 8 years old. I told the chamber that I had said yes. I told them I had meant it. I told them that whether I continued to mean it for the next decade was, in very large part, a function of what they did in this room going forward. Then I gave my address. The proposal was for a prevention charter, not a renamed version of the existing conflict resolution mechanism, which had 17 active review committees and had produced no meaningful action in response to New Carthage, or to Mevin, or to 43 other incidents that every delegation in the room could recite if asked. Something structurally different. A body with binding authority. A clear procedural distinction between a review has been requested, and an intervention is required. A response timeline that was measured in days rather than sessions. I said plainly that humanity had no interest in serving as the galaxy's permanent enforcement arm. I had said that in private to Owen Darcy and to Admiral Osei, and now I said it publicly, because I thought it needed to be on the record. We had spent 60 years as galactic citizens because we believed that communities were worth belonging to, and that membership meant something. We were willing to continue believing that, with conditions that reflected the actual world, rather than the one we had been pretending existed. The conditions were structural, not punitive. A response mechanism with authority that did not require unanimous consensus to act. A rotation of enforcement responsibility among all charter signatories, so that the work and the accountability were shared, rather than concentrated. A public record, fully accessible, of every decision made, and every decision deferred, with the rationale for each. And one additional clause that I had written myself and added to the final draft without consulting Owen Darcy or Yara Osei, not because I thought they would oppose it, but because I wanted it to exist in the document as something I had put there, with my name attached to it, as a matter of personal commitment. The clause specified that the Charter's first permanent record entry would be the name New Carthage, its official conclave registration number, its population of 3,200,000, and the exact text of the motion passed at the emergency session 1 year prior, which had created a review committee. It would remain at the top of every document, every record, every session log, in perpetuity. The Varath Collective co-sponsored the charter within the first hour of deliberations. Asha Koval presented their co-sponsorship with the same controlled composure she always carried. But I had learned in the past year to read her subtle signals, and she was not composed inside. She was something that had been waiting a long time to be what it actually was. The Solon Republic added a supplemental enforcement provision that improved the response timeline significantly. Species I had never heard take a voluntary position in a conclave session stood and added their names to the ratification discussion. The debate lasted 2 days, which for a conclave vote on a structural change to galactic governance was remarkably fast. Every previous attempt at similar proposals had dissolved into multi-year framework dialogues and competing amendment processes. This one moved because the room understood, in a way it had not understood a year ago, that choosing not to decide was itself a decision with consequences that were now documented in the permanent record. The Marin sovereignty, which had remained silent throughout the New Carthage session and throughout the war, signed the charter last. They did so without a formal statement, which everyone understood to mean that they had done their calculations and had arrived at an answer. The vote was not close. Owen Darcy called me the evening after the ratification, which was 6 in the morning his time, which meant he had been awake all night watching the results come in. He offered me the position of First Secretary of the Prevention Charter. I said I would accept on the condition that the secretary position rotate among species on a 3-year cycle. He was quiet for a moment. That will complicate continuity, he said. Yes, I said. It will also mean the charter belongs to the galaxy rather than to us, which is the only version of it that will actually work long-term. Another pause. You have changed, he said. I thought about what the last year had done to my understanding of things. I have learned the difference between patience and waiting, I said. And I have learned the difference between being a member of something and being responsible for it. He said good night. I said good night. The next morning I drove to Somerset. The Garrett family lived in a stone house at the edge of a village, with a river running along the bottom of the main street. The garden in front was smaller than the garden in back, and the back garden had an apple tree that was just starting to lose its leaves in the October light. Sarah answered the door before I knocked. She had heard my car on the gravel. She was wearing a dark green jumper, and her hair was in 2 uneven braids that she had clearly put together herself, without much concern for symmetry. She looked at me for a second, with the calm, assessing expression she always had, and then stepped back to let me in. We sat in the back garden while Nora Garrett brought tea. The October light came through the apple tree at a long angle, the kind of thin gold light that is particular to that season and that time of afternoon. The river was audible from the garden, not loud, just present. Sarah did not start any conversation immediately. She had the particular quality of someone who was comfortable with silence, as long as the silence was between people who did not need to fill it. I waited. Tell me what happened, she said eventually. The charter thing. All of it. So I did. I explained the structure of it, the rotating enforcement responsibility, the response timelines, the public record requirement. I explained it in the same way I would explain anything to someone who would ask precise follow-up questions if I was vague or imprecise, because she would. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she picked a blade of autumn grass from the arm of her garden chair and turned it between her fingers. So if someone tries to do to another colony what they did to ours, she said, the charter has to respond. It cannot just meet about it. Correct, I said. And the response has to happen within a specific number of days, not whenever they decide to get around to it. Within 72 hours of a verified incident, I said. She nodded slowly. And if the charter does not respond in time, or if it responds and it does not work? I looked at the apple tree and thought about Admiral Osei's hands flat on the table. I thought about 12,000 ships in the outer belt. I thought about 7 words going out across every frequency in the galaxy. I think, I said carefully, that the galaxy has a reasonably clear understanding now of what follows. She set down the blade of grass. She looked up at the sky, which was moving from its afternoon gold toward the quieter blue of early evening. "Good," she said. We stayed in the garden until the light went. Nora Garrett brought more tea and said something kind about the apple tree producing well this year, and Sarah asked if she could have a biscuit, and the ordinariness of it was the most remarkable thing I had experienced in a year full of remarkable things. After dinner, Sarah asked if I wanted to hear something she had been working on. She sat down at the upright piano in the front room, with her back very straight and her hands positioned with the careful deliberateness of someone still building the physical memory of the movements. She played without looking at any written music. The piece was not long. It was not technically elaborate, but it had something in it that I did not have a word for immediately, something that moved between registers in a way that was not quite sad, and was not quite resolved, something that kept returning to a central phrase without repeating it exactly, changing it slightly each time, as though looking at it from a different angle. When she finished, she turned around on the bench. "What is it called?" I asked. "New Carthage," she said. I sat in the chair by the window, and I did not say anything for a moment. The sound of the piece was still in the room the way sound is, fading but not entirely gone. "It is very good," I said. She looked at me in the straightforward way she had. "It is not about being sad," she said. I did not want it to be about being sad. I wanted it to be about what comes after. I thought about the charter document in the Conclave's permanent archive, with New Carthage at the top of the first page in permanent record. I thought about Asha Koval, standing at the podium for the first time in 11 years. I thought about 140 species signing a binding agreement, because the alternative was admitting that they had chosen, for a long time, to prefer the comfort of inaction to the difficulty of responsibility. "The galaxy did not become afraid of us because we were powerful," I said. "There are dozens of powerful species. They became afraid of us because we had been patient for so long, and they had finally seen what that patience cost us to maintain, and they had seen what it cost them when we stopped." She thought about this. "We should not have had to stop," she said. "No," I said. "We should not have." She turned back to the piano. She began to play the piece again from the beginning. I stayed in the chair by the window and listened all the way to the end, where the central phrase appeared one final time, changed again, slightly different from every previous version of itself. And this time it did not ask a question. It simply continued. Outside the window, the Somerset night was very dark and very quiet, and somewhere beyond the quiet and the dark, stretched out across distances that the human mind was not originally built to hold, the galaxy was learning something. It had taken 30 years of preparation, 26 days of conflict, and one 10-year-old girl at a piano to teach it. That we had always been here, that we had always been ready, and that the line, once crossed, would not be crossed again.